everyone, Ben with Virtuous here, and let's talk about donor expansion. It is a recipe with a lot of ingredients to it. We have discussed some strategies up to this point about increasing your average gift size, about converting donors to that next level of donor tier, so taking our everyday donors, converting them to mid-level donors, mid-level to major. But for those strategies to effectively push our expansion, increase our fundraising level, there is a bit of a prerequisite to the equation, and that is going to be in retaining our net donor dollars. We always talk about that golden rule. It is more efficient to retain an existing donor than it is to acquire a new one. But if those donors are not at minimum matching their previous giving, then our fundraising is still not necessarily going to be trending upwards. So we've got to focus, one, on retaining our donors, but also retaining the giving level that they're supporting us with. Now, the good news is that starts out with some pretty basic donor retention strategies, and that's just going to be focusing on cultivating and stewarding our relationships with our LIBUNT donors, and then more broadly, our lapsed donors. Again, good news. As we start to focus on these groups, they are both pre-built best practice queries in Virtuous, so you don't have to build anything to get started. I'm going to begin by looking at my LIBUNT donors, the folks who gave last year but have not yet given this year. So one of the recommended Virtuous strategies when we're thinking about donor expansion is to start implementing off-cycle gift asks, ones that are a little bit more focused, a little bit more targeted to individual donors. And one of the best places that I recommend to start fishing for that is looking at your LIBUNTs. We know that these donors are at least engaged as recently as last year, but like I said earlier, they just maybe haven't gotten around to giving this year. Now, if we're thinking about this group, that should naturally trend downwards as the year goes on, right? Maybe we've got John Smith. John Smith tends to give later in the year, maybe around Giving Tuesday. All right, that's fine. Until we get to that Giving Tuesday, we're not necessarily going to see the bulk of John Smith's giving. What we want to focus on is filling in the gaps, the folks who maybe aren't being retained through those natural regular giving cycles. So if we're looking at our LIBUNTs, I think of this as maybe our starting call list or our starting prospecting list. Some folks that we're paying closer attention to make sure that we're expecting to see giving at the cadence that this person generally tends to give through. Now, if we're thinking about incorporating this into an automation and perhaps powering a workflow from this, I would actually add a couple of additional ingredients. If we're looking at our criteria here, again, it's just based on that LIBUNT logic. Last year giving is greater than 0. This year's giving is 0. I might actually want to add a bit of a buffer here. So maybe something like last gift date is on or before, and I'll say 6 months ago. Of course, we can tailor that to whatever buffer would be appropriate for our strategy. But then I can have this automation running based on this query to say, hey, maybe just tapping me on the shoulder, giving me that task notification. I've got a major donor who is in my LIBUNT pool who 6 months into the year still has not given us a gift. Again, just something to highlight for me so I know this is probably someone I should focus a little bit more on. Now, as we're thinking about folks who perhaps continue to slip through the cracks, maybe actually do land in our lapsed donor pool, we'll probably want to implement a similar setup that is catching those folks as they slip through the cracks. So very similar to perhaps like a new donor welcome series, I might set up a lapsed donor series. And this is simply going to automatically trigger when someone lands in that lapsed group. Remember, in Virtuous, that lapsed donor tag is going to be automatically applied. But here it's doing that, tap on my shoulder, right? Hey, Ben, perhaps someone in your portfolio has actually landed in the lapsed group. It's going to start that automated communication sequence, and then it's going to include a couple of more personal touch points, having me send that handwritten card, and then finishing off with that direct personal phone call. Now, there's something else that's going on here, and that's going to be a branch for my reactivated donors. The idea being that, hey, we have this person who lapsed, but we were actually successful in getting that gift to pull them back into active donorship. We want to solidify that relationship, add a little bit of extra cultivation, a little bit of extra stewardship to make sure that they don't land in that lapsed group again in the future. Now, if this is our groundwork for donor retention, right, let's start thinking about a little bit of the more nuanced side of the coin in our donor dollar retention. Because like we talked about earlier, we might have a bunch of people who all gave us $1,000 last year, but if those same donors are only giving us $100 this year, Well, our donor retention metric might look great, but our revenue retention is not looking so hot, and we're certainly not expanding our fundraising level. So let's look at a query that can help us focus in on that group. And this is going to be comparing the last year's cumulative giving amount to this year's cumulative giving amount. In this case, I'm focusing on $1,000 as kind of my giving threshold. More on that in just a second. I have one criteria saying, okay, last year's giving is greater than or equal to 1,000, but this year's giving is still less than 1,000. So if I look at my results, this is literally my lapsed donor dollars. The dollars that were on the table last year, but haven't yet come in this year. So again, just like our previous example, this is maybe going to be my prospecting list, my call list to say, hey, reaching out with some additional solicitations or at least some additional touch points to try and get these donors to match their previous year's giving. I've added some columns here to see that last year cumulative giving, this year's giving, along with my average gift amount, so I can kind of see where the leaks in my ship are, where those discrepancies are at play, and then reach out accordingly. Now again, if we're thinking about incorporating this with automation, we might want to add a couple of extra ingredients here as well, right? I might want to actually go back to my criteria and think about this more in the context of true giving bands. If someone is maybe giving last year closer to the $10,000 mark, and this year they've given under $1,000, I want to treat them a little bit differently than someone who gave $1,000 last year and is at $800 this year. So what I might do instead is change my operator for last year's cumulative giving and instead use between. And maybe I'll have one query. This one might be looking at between $1,000 and $2,500. I'll have another one that's perhaps focused on $2,500 to $5,000 and then $5,000 to $10,000. And that gives me a little bit more control. I can incorporate those into a workflow where my $1,000 band is perhaps receiving more of those automated communications, a slightly different series for my $2,500 to $5,000. And then like we said, for those folks who are closer to that $10,000 threshold, perhaps that's strictly going to be those really personal touch points, giving them a phone call, setting up a meeting. So I hope that this has given you some good ideas, some good strategies on how you can continue to focus not only on that donor retention, but also your donor dollar retention to really successfully expand your donorship and keep your fundraising trending upwards.